A few years ago, a man named Jack brought his best friend Rick out to his family farm. This farmhouse had been in Jack's family for generations, going all the way back to his great grandfather's generation in the 1930s. The pair didn't get out to the isolated property until the sun had already gone down, but by all accounts, it was a perfect fall evening in Michigan. The air was crisp with a slight breeze, but not too cold. The sky was clear, and now, since they were far away from the city lights, they could see thousands of stars in the sky above them. The two were just sitting out in one of the pastures next to Jack's truck and just enjoying some beverages and enjoying the night when Rick said something that Jack found to be a little bit odd. Rick said, "This place has kind of a strangeness to it, doesn't it? Like something might be watching us. Did anything bad ever happen here?" Jack had to laugh at this because not only was it a strange question, but there had indeed been strange events happening at this farm for many decades by this point. And so Jack then recounted this history to Rick that I'm about to recount to you. Back in the 1930s, Jack's great-grandfather had purchased this farmhouse and the surrounding land, quite a large piece of land. And at the time, it was a functioning farm. And so it took a massive effort by the family to keep it running and to keep it economically viable. And this was the 1930s, so the country was in the midst of the Great Depression, and this farm was seen as potentially their ticket to economic stability. If they could keep this farm going, it could keep their family out of poverty and out of joblessness. And relatives and extended family would kind of come and go. They would come and they would work the farm for a little bit, or if the farm needed extra help, cousins would come by and aunts and uncles would come by, some living at the farm for extended periods, some living there permanently, some just coming for a few days when the farm needed help, and then some would come to give the appearance that they were helping, but really what they wanted was to use the lands to hunt on. The land had extensive fields and pastures, and then beyond that was very dense forest. And this was somewhat of an isolated farm. The closest neighbor was pretty far away, so far away that you might not see a neighbor for a month or two. Jack's great-grandfather had a cousin who loved to use the lands to hunt on. And again, this is the Great Depression, so some people don't have the money to go down to the grocer and fill up a cart with groceries. And so hunting was also a way that they could get food for their families without having to spend money. And the area was just teeming with wildlife. You had deers and rabbits and squirrels and possums and raccoons, and all of these could be used to sustain a family through this very difficult time in America's history. And so the cousin was at the farm for a bit, and he was helping with the farm work by day, and then at night he would go out to hunt raccoons in the pastures and the forest nearby. It's the cousin's last night on the farm, and he's worked all day, and so he's planning to, once the sun goes down, he's going to go out, he's going to hunt, and then sometime around midnight, he's going to get in his car and he's going to drive back home. Jack's great-grandfather was up well before the sun, as many farmers are, probably around 3 or 4 in the morning, so it's still very dark, and he noticed that the cousin's car was still in front of the house, which is not an immediate concern, but it is a little bit strange because this cousin had to get back home to see his family, and Jack's great-grandfather knew that he was planning on leaving by midnight. And although the cousin knew the land fairly well, it was extensive, and it was very easy to get turned around, especially at night. So kind of concerned for the well-being of his cousin, Jack's grandfather decides to go out and just do a quick search for him, even though it's still quite dark outside. He heads out to look for the cousin, and he knows the general vicinity where that cousin liked to hunt, so he starts heading in that direction. And that path took him on this kind of small dirt road that wound through a pasture that was behind the house. And then that pasture was situated just in front of some dense woods, and then off to the side of the pasture was some kind of swampy land. As the great-grandfather came around the bend in this dirt road, he called out the cousin's name. And after a moment, he heard a reply coming from the darkness. It sounded like his cousin, but at the same time, something was off. He couldn't tell exactly what it was, something in the tonality or the cadence of the voice. It sounded like his cousin, but at the same time, it just didn't. And so he pauses for a second, kind of thinking, that's a little strange. It sounds like him. He calls out his name once again. And this voice once again responds. But this second time, the voice that he hears in response is all wrong. It sounded gruff, and it almost sounded like a growl, like a growl of an animal that was somehow attempting to sound like a human. And this sent a chill up Great Grandpa's spine, because what kind of animal can make a noise like that? And the sun is still not up, mind you, and it's not even going to start coming up for probably another hour. And he starts to feel very vulnerable. There's something out there not that far off that initially was making sounds like it was his cousin's voice, and now it sounds like something that's imitating a human. He decides to sprint back to the safety of the farmhouse, and once the sun is up, he'll relaunch his search. Well, the sun eventually does come up, and the great-grandfather gets a group together to go and look for the cousin. As I mentioned, there were always extended family and friends who were staying at the farmhouse, so there was, a solid dozen or so people that were now going to go out to help search for the cousin. They return to the pasture where he knew the cousin liked to hunt, and they start scouring. They line up in a long line, and they start walking across the pasture, calling his name, and just looking for anything that could indicate that he had been there, whether it's boot prints or shell casings or anything. And eventually they do find something. They're sitting in the pasture. They find the cousin's rifle and his hat. The great-grandfather leans down and he picks up the hat, and it's intact, but it has this strange brown liquid on it that they couldn't identify. It was something they'd never seen before. And he picks up the cousin's rifle to take a look at that, and he realizes that the rifle hadn't been fired. It still had all of its rounds inside. They continue their search for hours, but they never find any other shred of evidence of the cousin. And in fact, for the next 6 decades, the great-grandfather would continue hoping that someday he would be walking around on the farm and he would find something, a piece of clothing or a bone fragment, just anything to give closure to the family about this cousin who had gone missing. But unfortunately, they never found anything. Aside from that hat and the rifle, they never found any sign of that cousin. You'll recall that there was kind of swampy land off to one side of the pasture, and so for a long time, the great-grandfather theorized, well, the cousin must have been lost in the dark, wandered into that swamp, and somehow drowned in there. Well, as years go by, the swamp starts to dry up, and the great-grandfather's thinking, finally, I'll be able to do a proper search to see if I can find the remains of my cousin. And as the swamp dried up, he went out daily to search for anything. And he never found a single thing. Even once the swamp was completely dried up, he never found a shred of evidence of his cousin. So the family never got closure. They thought either A, he drowned in the swamp and they were just unable to find anything in their searching, or B, an animal got him, like a mountain lion or a black bear, which of course there are mountain lions and black bears out there, or C, something else happened to him, something that's just completely unexplainable. And for the next 20 years into the 1950s, no other major event occurred on the farm or on its lands, although they would experience strange noises in the night, and occasionally animals would go missing, but it was never anything that you couldn't attribute to, say, a large predator in the area like a mountain lion. So 20 years go by into the 1950s, and now Jack's grandfather has been born and has started to grow up, although he's still quite a young man. He's 11 or 12 years old, and all of Jack's great aunts and uncles are born, and they start growing up on the farm. And as such, Jack's grandfather and all of his great uncles had become very accustomed to hunting for their food. Even at a young age, they spent a huge amount of time out in the pastures and in the woods, tracking squirrels and rabbits and things like that. Jack's great-grandfather had a very close friend named Joe, who was from one of the native tribes in the area, and Joe had almost become like an uncle to Jack's grandfather. He was always around. He's the one that taught him how to hunt and how to fish and how to survive out in the woods, and he was really just like a member of the family. And Joe was the best hunter that anybody in the family had ever seen. He was an expert tracker. He was a terrific shot, and what's more is nothing ever scared him. And one winter in the 1950s, they go out on a hunting expedition into the lands around the farm. And in total, there's 8 of them. It's mostly the younger kids, especially Jack's grandfather, and they're all being led by Joe. Snow had fallen pretty recently, and so it was kind of just a gloomy, cold day. But it was perfect for hunting because the white of the snow made it very easy to track deer, the brown of a deer crossing the white snow, or you could also pick up the tracks of animals if you could see them in the snow. And the group was hot on the trail of a group of deer, and they're walking way off to a corner of the farm that the family didn't usually go to. And finally, they spot a deer. And this deer is kind of a ways off, and it's too far for any of the young people in the group to hit, but it was easy work for Joe. So Joe gets his rifle up and he fires a shot, and it hits the deer, but it doesn't go down. The deer runs off. No matter, right? There's snow on the ground. They'll just follow the tracks and they'll follow the blood trail, and eventually it will lead them to the deer. And the tracks are just winding through this part of the land that the family rarely used. And so it was kind of unfamiliar terrain to most of the people in the group. It was very isolated, and it wasn't good farmland, so they kind of just left it alone. And as such, it was very overgrown, and it just kind of had a strange vibe to it. So Joe's in the lead, and Jack's grandfather is right behind him, because remember, Jack's grandfather is 11, 12 years old, and Joe is like his hero, so he always tries to stay close to Joe. And they've picked up the trail of the deer, and they can see that its tracks are leading out of this kind of pasture land and into some rather dense woods. But Joe sees what he thinks is a small deer trail that extends out into the woods, and so he starts heading into the woods with the rest of the hunting party following him. So they're walking through the woods, and they don't have to walk far, maybe only a few meters into the woods, when they come across this small clearing. And what happened next, Jack's grandfather would have difficulty talking about for many years. The clearing itself was very small, maybe only 6 or 7 feet in diameter, and it seemed to be in a very perfect circle, which struck everybody in the group as unusual. But what's most unusual was that in the middle of this perfectly circular clearing was the deer. It was laying on the ground, and as they got closer, they could see that this deer did not look like it had simply been shot. It looked like it had been torn to pieces. It was completely shredded, and all of the snow and the surrounding area was stained red. And it was weird. It made no sense. Why did it go to this perfectly circular clearing? And what could have done this? I mean, maybe a mountain lion, but the level of brutality that they saw in the deer would have been pretty excessive, even for a mountain lion. Jack's grandfather looks up at Joe to kind of gauge his reaction, and he sees that Joe's eyes were wide, and he looked afraid, but nothing scared Joe. Right? Mountain lions, black bears, poachers, nothing could ever rattle Joe. But as Jack's grandfather watched him, he saw Joe grab his rifle, and he heard the click as Joe flipped off the safety. Joe looked down at Jack's grandfather, and he said very seriously, "You take the safety off your rifle, you stay behind me no matter what, and you be ready for anything." He knew from Joe that you do not take the safety off your rifle until you're ready to shoot. So if Joe's telling him, take the safety off and be ready to shoot, something is seriously amiss here. Joe has his rifle at the ready, and he starts walking into the clearing very slowly, very cautiously. He's looking at the deer, he's looking at the surrounding area, looking at the ground, kind of surveying for tracks to try to figure out what could have done this to the deer. And Jack's grandfather's following Joe very close behind. Joe kneels down because he had indeed found a set of tracks, but They were kind of distorted in the snow, so it was difficult to tell exactly what they looked like, but from what the pair of them saw, it didn't look like any animal that either of them ever recognized. Certainly not the tracks of a mountain lion or a black bear or any of the animals that would be capable of doing this kind of damage to this deer. Joe stands back up and mutters something under his breath. And Jack's grandfather looks up at him and he sees Joe's eyes are now just full of terror. Something is really wrong here. Whatever Joe's suspicions had been of what could have done this apparently have been confirmed. And he grabs Jack's grandfather by the collar and he says to the rest of the group, "We need to get out of these woods right now. Follow me." And he grabs Jack's grandfather and he starts yanking him out of the woods. And he's trying to keep up with Joe, but Joe's moving very, very fast. And as Jack's grandfather is close to getting out of these woods, he hears not far away, maybe only 10 to 15 feet away, he hears what sounds like something big tramping through the undergrowth. He looks over expecting to see a mountain lion or a bear or something, but there's nothing there. He can hear it, but he can't see it. Finally, they make it back to the farmhouse. And when Joe comes back in, he tells all of the younger people to go into a different room. And he says to Jack's great-grandfather, right, who's much older by this point, he takes him into a separate room to speak with him privately. And Jack's grandfather kind of comes up to try to eavesdrop on the conversation. And he could hear Joe say, "You need to sell this land. It's not safe for your family to be here. You are all in danger if you stay on this land." And Jack's great-grandfather is saying, "Joe, what are you talking about? We've been out there hunting a million times. What is it that you saw?" And Joe won't give him any more information than that, but he says to him, "Look, I know I'm a good friend of yours, and I'm very sorry to say this, but I can never come on this land again." And he never did. Joe remained a very close family friend until the end of his life, but he would never again step foot on that farmhouse or the lands. Years later, Jack's great-grandfather is long gone by this point, and Joe is on his deathbed. He's getting close to when he's going to pass, and so Jack's grandfather comes to visit him to pay his respects and to talk to his old friend that he looked up to one final time. Joe's final words to Jack's grandfather are, "You don't know how lucky we were. We almost didn't make it out of those woods. We were so very lucky." Jack's grandfather to this day will not set foot on that part of the farm where he had that experience. And just FYI, in relation to where that cousin went missing in the 1930s, this is on the complete opposite side of the land and nearly a mile away from that swampy area. 20 more years pass without a significant event like that, although they still had the strange sounds and occasionally animals would go missing, but there wasn't anything else to that degree as those previous two stories. Now, Jack's father had grown up on the farm as well, just as his father had. And he was a young man, 18 or 19 years old, and he was planning on joining the military. But he decided that before he ships off to basic training, he's going to have just one more nice, relaxing weekend on the farm. So he invites one of his best friends out to the farm, and they plan on just kind of relaxing and talking about old times before they have to go their separate ways. So just like Jack was at the start of this story, Jack's father and his friend are also parked out in one of the pastures, and they were planning on setting up a tent and just kind of camping out there and having a relaxing night. But in the woods that were adjacent to this pasture, they start to hear something moving around. Growing up on the farm, Jack's dad knew what various animals sounded like as they moved through the brush. He could tell you what a squirrel was, what a raccoon was, what a deer was, and this animal sounded big. It sounded more like a black bear than anything else, but it was moving much faster than a black bear will usually casually walk through the woods. It was far too heavy to be a deer, and it was too loud and too clumsy to be a mountain lion. His friend says to Jack's dad, "What is that that's walking through the woods?" And saying, I don't know. It doesn't sound like anything I can pinpoint." And so the friend, being also 18, 19 years old, says, well, let's go check it out. And he grabs some flashlights, and the two of them start walking over to the tree line with their flashlights pointed at where they think this sound is coming from. And at first, they saw nothing. They saw no movement happening in the trees. But although they couldn't see anything, they could definitely still hear something. It was eerily similar to what happened to Jack's grandfather. He couldn't see whatever was moving through the trees, but he could definitely hear it. Those crashing sounds through the brush started to get louder and faster and more intense, and it started to sound like whatever this was, it was coming straight for the pair of them. They started to realize that this was a huge and potentially fatal mistake. So they start backing up very slowly at first, just trying to get some distance between them and the trees. And they're just about ready to turn off their flashlights and turn around and run back to the truck, when for just a split second, they see something. It was only there for that small moment between when their brain told their hand to turn off the flashlight and the flashlight actually turned off. But they definitely saw something there. For only a moment, they saw a pair of big yellow eyes that were staring at them through the trees, and they saw a wide snout full of teeth. But something about it was not right. Like the proportion of the space between the eyes and the teeth was not normal for any animal that they knew of. The snout could be comparable to a wolf or a coyote, but it was too wide and it was almost misshapen. Seeing this, the two guys started to run for their life, run to the truck. And the entire time they're thinking that at any second, something is just going to grab me and the lights are going to go out and that's going to be it. Just as they were reaching the truck, when they were close enough to reach out for the door handles, they heard this noise. They described it as a howl, but it wasn't really a howl. It was a howl and a growl and a yell unlike anything that they had ever heard in their lives. And it was impossibly loud. This animal, whatever it was, must still be out in the tree line, but the sound of this was almost deafening. They didn't stop, though. They got in the truck. They didn't bother to take down their camp. They got in the truck and they just got the heck out of there. And now we're back to the present day. Jack finished telling Rick this brief history of the farm and of the lands, and he'd heard these stories growing up, and it's not that he didn't believe his family. He fully trusted that they wouldn't lie to him, but at the same time, these stories were just kind of larger than life. And he thought, maybe they aren't lies, but they're probably exaggerations, right? There's no way that all of this crazy stuff happened. Or maybe they were just stories that the parents would tell to their kids to make sure they didn't wander off in the night and get picked up by a mountain lion or a bobcat or something like that. And Rick was horrified by these stories, right? Especially about the cousin who apparently died in the 1930s. And he asked why a more proper search of the area hadn't been done. Why hadn't there been a big grid search? Why didn't they bring in, 100 people to search the entire area? Even if they couldn't find his remains, maybe they could find something, his clothing, shoes, something that would give the family some closure. Or even something that could shed some light on what this was that was causing all of these happenings around the farm. And Jack kind of laughed at this and tried to reassure Rick that, these stories are probably not true or exaggerated. It's nothing to worry about. As a reminder, the pair had parked their truck kind of away from the house, right? Just as Jack's father had done years prior, although in a different position, kind of somewhat near to the farm's barn. The house at the time was being lived in by some of Jack's cousins, and although it wasn't as highly operational as it had been back in its heyday, it was still very much a functioning farm, just on a smaller scale. As the pair of them sat, just kind of staring off into the darkness, they both started to feel very uneasy. And Jack is thinking at first, it's probably just because I was telling Rick all of these scary stories. Of course, I'm going to get a little bit creeped out myself, but the more he thinks about it, the more he realizes that something else is creeping me out. There's something in the air. I feel like something's watching me. He couldn't figure out what it was, but something in the more primal part of his brain was telling him that he was in danger. Just then, the dog started to bark. There was a big dog pen next to the house where the cousins kept 4 German Shepherds, and when the weather was warm enough, the German Shepherds liked to sleep outside. They had these little shelters inside of the pen. And they weren't just barking, though. They were absolutely freaking out. They were barking, they were howling, they were growling and thrashing and making all of the sounds that dogs will usually make if they're planning on doing some real fighting. Then they heard pounding, and it was pounding on the chain link fence of this dog pen. It was this heavy, rhythmic, aggressive pounding. And whatever was doing this, it had to have been something completely massive. And Jack's thinking to himself, maybe it's a black bear. A mountain lion's not going to pound on something like that, but it could be a black bear. Jack looks to Rick and he says, okay, we need to get in the truck. It's time to go. And as the pair was about to reach the truck, just as Jack's father had many years prior, they heard something completely terrible. It wasn't the sound of a black bear, and it wasn't the sound of a mountain lion. It was deep, and it was guttural. It was both a howl and a scream, and it was impossibly loud. By the time they reached the dog pen, whatever it was that had launched this attack was gone. And they counted the dogs, and they only saw 3 of them. One of the dogs was missing. They go into the house to wake up the cousins, and somehow the cousins had slept through this whole onslaught. And they eventually chalked it up to the fact that they use this really loud white noise machine. But they come outside to see this complete devastation of the dog pen, and 3 of their dogs are just cowering. Now, these are German Shepherds. These are not fearful dogs. These are the dogs that you bring onto the farm to protect the other animals from predators. And something happened that was so terrifying to them that these 3 dogs are now cowering, and one of them, the 4th dog, is missing. Authorities came to the farm the next day to inspect the damage, and they ruled that this was the result of a coyote attack. Jack knew that was impossible. Coyotes cannot smash chain link fences to bits, and it would take a ridiculous number of coyotes to take on a pack of 4 German Shepherds. Jack knows that whatever attacked the dogs that night, it's the same thing that's been around for 4 generations, and it's probably going to be around a lot longer. Thank you so much for watching my spooky video. Please let me know what you think about this one. I was kind of amazed when I found it that I had never seen this one before. Again, this story is allegedly true, alleged by the person who wrote this out. Does that mean it's 100% true? I don't know, but they're saying that it is. If you think it's totally made up, say it in the comments. If you think, this is true because I experienced something just like that, you can say it in the comments too. But as always, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the likes. And if you have not yet subscribed, please feel free to, or don't. I'll only be a little bit hurt if you don't, but I'll be very happy if you do. But thank you all very much. Bye-bye. I will now return to my void.